what I want to do tonight, ladies and gentlemen, as best as I can, is look at the answers to 4 themes that society is constantly wrestling with, particularly the skeptic, constantly wrestling with, and how in their answers I see that those answers are in many ways hinting in the direction that a Christian himself would have to give, except they are giving it from a secular worldview. And what I want to do is look at 4 answers that they give. Listen to me very carefully now. 4 answers that they give to which only the question that justifies them is the one that also legitimizes why Jesus Christ is the only way. 4 answers they give to which the only question that legitimizes these answers is also the question that has implicit in it why Jesus Christ is the only way to God. And when you examine these, you'll begin to see what I'm really driving at. You almost have to wait till the last 5 to 10 minutes of the presentation to see how this thing actually comes together. The first is the reality and the mystery of evil. The reality and the mystery of evil. Just a month or so ago, in the New York Times of all places, there was a lead article, and it said this: for the worst of us, the diagnosis may be evil. Here's what the writer says: predatory killers often do far more than commit murder. Some have lured their victims into homemade chambers for prolonged torture. Others have exotic tastes for vivisection, sexual humiliation, burning. Many perform their grisly rituals as much for pleasure for themselves as for any other reason. Among themselves, a few forensic scientists have taken to thinking of these people as not merely disturbed, but actually evil. Evil in that deliberate, habitual savagery, and defies any psychological attempt at explanation or attempt at treatment. Most psychiatrists assiduously avoid this word evil, contending that its use would precipitate a dangerous slide from clinical to moral judgment that could put people on death row unnecessarily and obscure the understanding of violent criminals. But many career forensic examiners now say that their work forces them to reflect on the concept of evil, and some actually acknowledge that they can find no other term for certain individuals they have evaluated. In an effort to standardize what makes a crime particularly heinous, a group at New York University has now been developing what it calls a depravity scale, which rates the horror of an act by the sum of its grim details. And a prominent personality expert at Columbia University has published a 22-level hierarchy of evil behavior derived from detailed biographies of more than 500 violent victims. We are talking about people who commit breathtaking acts, who do so repeatedly, who know what they are doing, and who are doing it in peacetime under no threat to themselves, said Dr. Michael Stone, the Columbia psychiatrist, who's examined several hundred killers at Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center in New Hampton, New York, and others at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, where he consults and teaches. We know from experience who these people are and how they behave, and it is about time, he said, that we give their behavior the proper appellation. And it goes on, debating with other scholars. When Ronald Reagan, during his presidency, referred to the Soviet Union as that evil empire, and then looked into the eye of the camera and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, pull that wall down. Pull that wall down." He was intimating at an ideology that had extracted the lives of millions of people, both in its home territory and outside. Just a few weeks ago, as I said, my colleagues and I were in Berlin. And as we were walking in where that checkpoint Charlie once stood, separating east from west, where the wall no longer stands, you can see memorabilia, you can buy books, but unfortunately, people tend to forget that that wall was just in the recent past history. Prior to that, when you examine all that had gone on in Germany and all that the Berliners had been subjected to, you begin to actually see how that hell may well have been in session, and evil was the only description you could give to what had gone on. I was reading the journals of several men and women trapped during the rulership of the Third Reich. I was reading one just this morning from a 17-year-old German soldier, a man who was, his name is Helmut Altner, who was a conscript in the army and happened to be there in the last stand in April almost 60 years ago to this very day. And he was going through the streets with his comrades knowing that minutes were lying ahead and it would all be over. Listen to a 17-year-old writing. We're on the great road to Berlin. The inhabitants stand outside their doors. They shrink back as our steps echo loudly off the walls of the houses. Then they breathe again with satisfaction because we are Germans. Time is pushing on, inexorably towards the final hour. Women are pressing in from the south. Men hurry across the road, glancing around timidly. SS patrols drive their cars through the streets, stopping a man here, picking up a man there. The car drives off, motors singing. Members of the People Reserve, mainly in SS uniform, close the anti-tank obstacles. Hitler Youth walk the streets proudly with anti-tank grenade launchers. On our right is a large square ringed by the facades of bombed-out houses. 2 SA men in uniform stand by a lamppost. Ah, a civilian is hanging bound to a post. There is a red electric cable around his neck, which has bitten deeply into his flesh. His face is blue. His eyes are sunken in the sockets. Around his neck hangs a white cardboard sign saying, "I am Otto Mayer. I was too cowardly to fight for my wife and my child. That is why I am hanging here. I am a rat." I feel a choking sensation inside me as I see this. I would like to look away, and yet I cannot take my eyes off this terrible spectacle. The SA men are laughing and smoking. The dead man swings quietly in the wind. A civilian walking alongside explains in a low voice why this soldier was hanged. He came back just like us, exhausted and war-weary. He escaped the raging battle of extermination and encirclement before the gates of Berlin. He was so young. His wife begged him to stay, and he gave in. Neighbors betrayed him. The SS picked him up. Before the eyes of his horrified wife, before the eyes of his child, he was brutally murdered. First, though, he had to write the shameful sign with his own hands. The SS dictated the text, grinning. Then they strung him up, the wires cut into his neck, and soon killed him. His wife lay unconscious on the ground. The SS drove away. The SA men took over. Journal after journal after journal. This kind of brutality, this kind of mass killing. What do we call this? How do we escape the obvious when we see such horrific acts that remind us human beings have committed slaughter for all kinds of reasons? You know, interestingly, from Germany, I went on to India, as I said, and then into Thailand. While I was in Thailand, actually, on that morning, I just left Indonesia, and that morning, another massive earthquake struck. You may have remembered reading it. And they were afraid of another tsunami warning that was given with the tides that they thought would swell up once again, and tens of thousands could be lost. I was in Bangkok. Phuket is where the resort was that was hit the last time. So all of the hotel managers had to evacuate their guests and left a lot of money. Lost a lot of money. In the Bangkok Post the next day, when the tsunami didn't arrive, was this interview with men and women who were strippers in these resorts. I won't take the time to read it to you, but basically what it says is this, that these strippers have a particular name given to them. And these men and women were utterly infuriated at the management for a false alarm, because most of them now lost their livelihood. All of those who complained for one reason. I want you to hear me now. This is a fact in the land happening to large numbers of young men. They have found out that the way they can make their money is by a sex change operation that costs $10,000. There are thousands of them performing in these resorts to earn money so that they can effectively actually have the sex change operation done and earn money as a woman dancer somewhere. The words go something like this. It's a dream to become a woman, but my income dropped after the tsunami because the tourists fell away. I don't know what else to do, and I love this job. Suki, who is saving for a sex change operation, does not know if it'll be good for his career, but it's his dream to become a woman. Dam, a 30-year-old man who has undergone a sex change, said his income from tips was so meager that his colleagues would probably have to wait a long time before they raised money for the operation themselves. On Monday night, I didn't run like the others, said one. I was sound asleep. If the tsunami had struck, I would be in a real bad shape. So these men, bemoaning a false alarm because it kept them from 1 or 2 days of tips in order to transform the body to look like that of a woman and market themselves in the arena of the sex trade. What do you say to things like this? How do you react? So whether it's violence or sensuality, and then you come over to the United States. It was that very week in Bangkok, all over the news was plastered the tragic shooting that took place in Minnesota at the hands of a young man. And you look around our society and you see things like this happening. What I want to say is this, ladies and gentlemen, whether it's violence or sensuality or brutality or whatever it is, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, who are we? And what is the locus of evil? Who are we as a people? In this brilliant book that Os Guinness has just written called Unspeakable, he gives us a very fascinating account. He gives us a fascinating account of what was happening a decade ago in Rwanda, where hundreds of thousands, I think 800,000 or 1 million men and women lost their lives in the slaughter at that time. One world leader, whom I shall leave unnamed, arrived there, landed, left his plane engines running, and spent 2 hours at the airport talking to the NATO forces and talked to the NATO general, who happened to be Canadian. And just before he took off, he looked at the NATO general and said to him, "I'm really sorry. I didn't know it was this bad." And the NATO general responded after this world leader left, and he says this. He says, didn't know? He didn't know? He says, I've spent my life in NATO and I know what NATO planes overhead knew. Now I am haunted by dreams by the eyes of thousands and thousands of Africans disembodied, dismembered, staring out at the African darkness. Listen to what he says now. You cannot just walk away from something like that saying, you didn't know and you didn't know what you could. You can't just Pontius Pilate 800,000 people. The first point I want to make to you is this. No, it's not Rudolf Hess. No, it's not the Nazis. No, it's not the Russian soldiers who came there in the slaughter. It's reflective of all of us. We're all in this together. And as the Allied forces knew what was happening in the slaughter of millions and millions of people, and world leaders were really in some ways handcuffed or in other ways not even dealing with it, the whole world was implicated. And so the first thing we need to bear in mind is, it is not that the evil is there done by somebody else. All of humanity shares this. We cannot Pontius Pilate a mass of humanity and say others are doing it. But the second point I want to make is this, and this is very critical in the body of what I'm trying to say to you. When we are talking about evil, Guinness lists a whole host of humanistic writers who basically make this pronouncement in one way or the other. Listen, for example, Virgil in his Aeneid. What region of the earth is not full of our calamities? Thomas Hobbes in De Homine, man is the most cunning, the strongest, and the most dangerous animal. Voltaire, after the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, where tens of thousands died, writes to a pastor, I pity the Portuguese like you, but men still do more harm to each other on their little molehill than nature does to them. Our wars massacre more men than are swallowed up by our earthquakes. The skeptic David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion, man is the greatest enemy of man. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the humanist in Émile, seek the author of evil no longer, it is yourself. And here's what I want to say to you. If these are humanists talking, and the answer then is that humanity itself is wrong, what is the question? The question is, where is evil located? It's located in your heart and mine. Where is evil located? And ladies and gentlemen, if that is true, can you really deal with the humanistic agenda without first recognizing what the problem is with humanity? And so I phrase my question to the first answer this way. Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? And can you talk of educating society without first looking inside the human heart? Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? And can you talk of educating a society without first looking inside the human heart? Have you looked into your own heart lately? And as I travel and as I see and as I read, I know how easy it is for you and I to fall victims to the same thing. No, we may not go the route of a man somewhere in Phuket who wants to spend $10,000 changing his body so he can market himself, but we too have a price tag and sell our convictions for other reasons. Until you've seen your own heart, you will never be able to, with the humanist, talk about evil and let it just hang there in isolation. You have to anchor it in some way. So my first question is this: can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? Can you talk of educating humanity without first looking inside the human heart? The second is this. First is the reality and mystery of evil. The second is the quest for human justice. How we long and long and long for human justice. Years ago, a book was written called The Insanity Plea, and one of the cases given was that of Hinckley in his attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. And the man writing the book said, we are going to be faced, and we are now, he said, faced with a strange situation. He said the man prosecuting him, saying he was guilty and should be incarcerated. The man defending him said he was actually insane and ought to be exonerated. And finally, when he was put away, he said the time is going to come where the man who was trying to prosecute him is going to say he is actually insane and ought to be kept in there. And the man who was defending him is going to say he's not insane, now he has to be released. That's exactly what happened. And at the end of it, you wonder who's insane. Whether it's the man who was being tried or whether it was our very judicial system. Some years ago, I read these words by a 14-year-old in Bosnia. Here's what he said. So many people have been killed fighting for justice. But what justice? Do they really know what they're fighting for? The weather is growing colder now. No longer can you hear the singing of birds, only the sound of children crying for a lost mother or father or brother or sister. We are all now the children without a country and without hope. What justice? What justice do you see in courts today that makes you think we have keepers of the law who truly understand what moral guilt is all about? Centuries ago, Aristotle said these profound words. Hear me carefully, please. Justice alone of all the virtues is thought to be for another's good because it is related to our neighbor, for it does what is advantageous to another. Now the worst man is he who exercises his wickedness both towards himself and towards his friends. And the best man is not he who exercises virtue towards himself, but he who exercises it towards another. For this is a difficult task. Justice in this sense then is not a part of virtue, but virtue entire. Nor is the contrary injustice a part of vice, but vice entire. Do you see what Aristotle is saying? In his estimation, he thinks justice is not a part of virtue, but it is the heart of virtue. And injustice is not just on the fringe of being evil. He said it is at the heart of all evil. That's why he said justice is the firmest pillar of good government. Justice is the firmest pillar of good government. When the Lord looked down at his messenger Micah, he says, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly before the Lord? What God is saying is justice is that pristine virtue which a society is called upon to display and which you and I as individuals must always have. I remember when I was a young student at university in Delhi, we sat on stools and didn't even have a desk in front of us. We used to have our notepads on our laps and we'd be writing. And I think at that time I was a pre-med student or something like that. And there was a class full and the professor was lecturing. And just then one student was asked to answer a question, as was customary. When the professor asked you to answer a question, you stood up. So he stood up and started to answer. There was a real renegade guy sitting next to me, and gradually he used his foot to pull the stool back so that when the student was going to sit down, he'd come crashing down onto the floor. In the last moment, I saw that the stool had been pushed back, and I reached out to push it into the right place just too late as the student sat down and he came crashing onto the floor. And the professor saw my hands on the stool and just looked at me and said, "Zacharias, get out." I said, "But sir," he said, "get out." So I folded my books, walked out of there. Till this day, that irks me. It bothers me. Not so much at the fellow who pulled the stool away. He was an idiot. But at the professor who wouldn't even give me a chance to explain what actually happened. In this grand cosmic scheme of things, it has not affected anything except me. That little act of injustice bothered me. What do you think happens in a world where crime is rife, where rapes, murders, abuse, injustices take place? How it must break the pure heart of God that we have violated so much, and all we have as a response is one injustice piled after another. You see again and again and again this cry for justice, the cry for justice. Look at what has happened in the victimization of millions of people across our globe. You know, I hail from a part of the world that is quite deprived monetarily. And every time I go there, I find myself in some settlement of the impoverished. I'll walk into the homes of some people who live with very little. I never hesitate to walk into some of those slums, and you see in a different kind of fashion, injustice upon injustice upon injustice. It's piled one upon the other. I want to position this in contradistinction to a man I knew, known to many of my staff, known to many of you who have attended some of our events. Many of you may remember a very noble man by the name of Brent McKnight, who came from South Carolina. He was a federal judge and actually was being tapped on his way one day to possibly being a Supreme Court nominee. So a brilliant man, a gracious man, one of the nicest human beings I have ever known, or we at RZIM have ever known. He came and spoke to our audience once about law and justice, a decent, honorable man. And I remember on one occasion as Margie and I were having a meal with him and his wife, I said, "Brent, what is the most difficult part about being a judge?" He said, "I'll never forget the occasions where I've had to come down and make a judgment call on somebody, and knowing what the law said and knowing what the truth was about the case. And as I have made the pronouncement and knowing it is going to cost somebody years behind bars or somebody an awful lot in many ways," he said, "Ravi, I've actually gone back into my chambers and buried my face in my hands and wept uncontrollably at having to play the part of a judge." Just 3 or 4 months ago, in his early 50s, he was suddenly stricken with cancer and within weeks lost his life. But I think of the judge like him who recognizes there's a law to be honored, and yet there's a broken heart in the process that somebody is going to have to pay. And he goes back into his private chambers and weeps. That's the kind of judge you respect. That's the kind of judge you honor. And so here's my second question for the skeptic who talks for justice. It is this: you cannot cry for justice unless you can also know the justifiable source for all law. You cannot cry for justice unless you can also know the justifiable source for all law. First thing, Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? Can you talk of education without first looking inside the human heart? Second question, you cannot cry for justice unless you know the justifiable source for all moral law. While we were in Nuremberg, we found ourselves in courtroom 600, where the trials were actually held. And you see the furnishings. You almost wish that furniture could talk and the walls could talk. But as we walked in, I noticed two pictures. First is above the door as you walk in. It's the picture of the serpent tempting Adam and Eve. And above the tribunal are the 10 Commandments. Isn't that interesting? You will be as gods, is what Satan said, defining good and evil. And when they ate of that fruit, the slippery slope was entered into. And then the moral law was given. And what happened at Nuremberg? The justice, the American justice, trying to bring evidence after evidence after evidence. And every Nazi officer said, we were operating according to the law of our own land. We were operating according to the law of our own land. Till finally the justice cries out, but gentlemen, is there not a law above our laws?
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. If you'd like to know more about this ministry, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. Our mailing address is Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia 30010.
Hello friends, this is Ravi Zacharias. I just want you to know that it's a high pace that we keep constantly on the move, but every so often we pause and look back. And as I look back upon the last year, I'm amazed at all the ground we covered, all that was accomplished, and truly the tens of thousands of lives that were touched. I get reports from the United Kingdom, from Turkey, from the Middle East, from India, from China, and the Asia-Pacific launch that we're making. And as I look back, I think of two or three things. Number one, how God protected us, granted us safety, and brought us back safely to our families. We can't take that for granted in this day and age where so many things happen. But the next thing that I want to remind you of is how much God blesses along the way. To see people at the altar, the one-on-one conversations, the lives that are transformed. All of this happens because you make it possible for us to be there. I want to thank you and urge you to continue supporting us. Without you, none of this would be possible. God bless you.
Next time on Let My People Think.
Think of love, the nobility of it, the sacrifice of it, the circumference of it, and yet it has boundaries.
Let My People Think is a listener-supported television ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.